For more than 70 years, Americans were told something very simple about global power. If the world's most important sea lanes were threatened, the United States Navy would keep them open. That belief shaped oil markets, military doctrine, alliance politics, and the entire post-war idea of freedom of navigation. But what happens when the most important energy choke point on Earth is no longer simply open or closed, but effectively filtered, rationed, and conditionally controlled by a regional power willing to absorb risk that Washington is trying to avoid? What happens when the question is no longer whether America is stronger than Iran overall, but whether America can guarantee commercial passage through a narrow, heavily threatened waterway right now, today, under live fire conditions? That is the real story in the Strait of Hormuz, and the latest update is more serious than many people realize. As of today, the Strait of Hormuz is not back to normal. It is not fully secure. It is not freely navigable in the old sense. Instead, the latest reporting suggests a much more dangerous reality. Movement through the strait is still heavily restricted, politically filtered, and shaped by Iranian coercive power on the water. On March 24th, Iran told the United Nations Security Council and the International Maritime Organization that so-called non-hostile vessels may transit the strait if they coordinate with Iranian authorities and comply with Tehran's security regulations. That is a remarkable statement, because it means Iran is no longer merely threatening the choke point. It is openly asserting the right to decide who qualifies for safe passage and who does not. And that is where the story moves from military tension to strategic shock. Because the traditional American position has always been that Hormuz is an international waterway governed by international law, not a checkpoint where Tehran gets to separate acceptable ships from enemy-linked ones. Yet that is increasingly what the shipping picture now resembles. The Associated Press reported that Iran appears to be creating something like a de facto toll booth system. According to that reporting, some ships are entering Iranian waters near Larak Island, being vetted through intermediaries tied to the Revolutionary Guard, and in at least 2 cases, passage payments were reportedly made in Chinese yuan. Whether one calls it screening, coercion, extortion, or selective passage, the message is the same. Iran is trying to turn operational control into political leverage. Now think about what that means in plain English. Iran does not need to own the Strait of Hormuz legally in order to dominate it practically. It only needs enough capability to make free passage too dangerous, too expensive, too uncertain, or too politically explosive for its opponents to enforce. And that appears to be exactly the space Tehran is exploiting. Traffic through the strait has reportedly fallen by around 90% since the war began, according to AP's summary of shipping data. Reuters has described the route as effectively blocked by Iran, with global oil and liquefied natural gas flows severely disrupted. This is not a theoretical vulnerability anymore. It is a real-time stress test of whether the U.S.-led order can still guarantee commerce in the face of layered, asymmetric threats. And here's the detail that makes this story so uncomfortable in Washington. The United States has not demonstrated the ability to simply override that pressure and reopen the strait on demand. On March 10th, Reuters reported that the U.S. Navy had been refusing near-daily requests from the shipping industry for military escorts through Hormuz, saying the risk of attack was too high for now. That is a crucial point. Public rhetoric from top officials suggested escorts were possible and could happen when necessary. But privately, in industry briefings, the message was more cautious. Not yet, not safely, not under current conditions. That gap between strategic image and operational reality is exactly why this crisis matters so much more than the average oil shipping story. The contradiction did not disappear as the month went on. By March 17th, the White House was saying tankers were starting to dribble through the strait, suggesting that pressure on Iran might be working. But even then, Reuters described the movement as limited, not a return to normal commerce. Then on March 25th, the White House said it was tracking very closely how to get oil tankers through Hormuz, but still had no specific timeline for when tankers could move freely. That is the language of uncertainty, not restored control. If the waterway were genuinely secure, officials would be announcing schedules, coalition lanes, convoy regimes, or reopening milestones. Instead, the public message remains cautious, improvised, and incomplete. So why is this so hard? Why can't the strongest navy in the world just escort tankers through a narrow passage and call Iran's bluff? Because Hormuz is not just a line on a map. It is a dense threat environment compressed into a confined maritime corridor. Reuters, citing maritime and military experts, says defending convoy operations there is significantly harder than securing the Red Sea. Iran's threat set includes drones, missiles, explosive boats, floating mines, mini-submarines, GPS disruption, and launch positions along a steep coastline where reaction times can shrink to minutes. In other words, this is not a clean blue water showdown between fleets. It is a layered ambush zone where even a superior military can be forced into unacceptable risk calculations. And there is another nuance most viral videos leave out. Not every dramatic claim about the strait has been conclusively proven. Reuters reported on March 25th that U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said there was no clear evidence that Iran had mined the strait, even after reports that about a dozen mines had been deployed. At the same time, a joint statement from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada condemned Iran's attacks, de facto closure of the strait, and what they described as mine-laying, drone attacks, and missile attacks on commercial shipping and civilian infrastructure. So the picture is this: the threat is undeniable, the disruption is undeniable, but some specific battlefield details remain contested or still developing. That matters if you want credibility with an American audience. Now let's talk about the mine countermeasure problem, because this is where the strategic embarrassment gets sharper. Last year, the Navy replaced 4 aging Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships in Bahrain with 3 Independence variant littoral combat ships carrying mine countermeasure mission packages. But on March 16th, USNI News reported that 2 of those 3 ships, USS Tulsa and USS Santa Barbara, were spotted in Malaysia on a logistics stop far from Bahrain. The report also noted that since the conflict with Iran began, there had been no reports of U.S. surface ships operating in the Persian Gulf. Even if the logistics stop is temporary and routine, the optics are brutal. The world's most important maritime choke point is under crisis conditions, and America's specialized mine warfare posture and theater looks thin, stretched, and far from reassuring. That does not mean the United States is powerless. Far from it. The U.S. still has overwhelming strike capability, surveillance capability, alliance networks, and escalation dominance in multiple domains. But power is not the same thing as guaranteed operational freedom. That distinction is the heart of this entire story. A superpower can destroy targets and still fail to restore confidence for insurers, tanker operators, financiers, and ship captains. Reuters reported that Chubb joined the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation's Maritime Reinsurance Plan to help support ships transiting Hormuz. Insurance does not surge into a market because things are calm. It surges because risk is severe enough that normal commercial structures are failing. If governments are having to backstop war risk insurance, the market is telling you something official speeches often won't. And the market signal here is global. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says about 20 million barrels per day of oil moved through Hormuz in 2024, around 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. And around 20% of global LNG trade also passed through the strait, primarily from Qatar. More than a quarter of global seaborne oil trade depends on this corridor. There are some bypass pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but the EIA estimates only about 2.6 million barrels per day of spare bypass capacity may be available, nowhere near enough to fully replace the strait. So when people say Hormuz matters, they do not mean it matters in a symbolic way. They mean the modern energy system still has a narrow throat, and Hormuz is it. For a U.S. audience, there is one more important layer. America is less directly dependent on Gulf crude than it used to be. The EIA says the United States imported about 0.5 million barrels per day of crude and condensate from Persian Gulf countries through Hormuz in 2024, equal to roughly 7% of U.S. crude and condensate imports and around 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. That means the United States is not as physically exposed as major Asian importers. But that should not create false comfort. Oil is globally priced. LNG disruptions reshape trade flows, insurance spikes feed freight costs, and when energy surges, inflation travels. So even if the U.S. is not first in line for physical shortage, American households still feel the consequences at the pump, in food prices, in airline tickets, and across the broader inflation story. Asia, meanwhile, is much more exposed. The EIA estimates that 84% of crude oil and condensate moving through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets, and 83% of LNG moving through Hormuz also went to Asia. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the biggest crude destinations. China, India, and South Korea were top LNG destinations. That is why even partial, selective reopening matters geopolitically. AP reported that Iran-linked ships represented an outsized share of the vessels getting through, while China remains the main customer for Iranian oil. If Tehran can keep some flows moving to friendly or tolerated buyers, while restricting or politicizing the broader channel, then it is not simply causing chaos, it is shaping the market selectively and extracting leverage at the same time. That selective passage model may be the most important today update of all. Early in the crisis, the world talked about Hormuz in old binary terms, open or closed. But the latest reality looks more like controlled scarcity. Ships can move, but only in limited numbers, under extraordinary caution, and increasingly under conditions shaped by Iran. Reuters reported Iran telling the UN that non-hostile ships can pass if they coordinate with Iranian authorities. AP reported that vessels are being vetted, and in some cases, effectively taxed. That means Iran may be trying to normalize a new operational fact. Not a total blockade, but a gatekeeping regime. And if that sticks, even temporarily, it would represent one of the most consequential maritime coercion successes of the modern era. So has the United States actually lost control of the Strait of Hormuz? The most accurate answer is more precise and more damaging. The U.S. has not lost global naval superiority. It has not lost the ability to strike, retaliate, deter in other theaters, or massively escalate. But it has, at minimum, lost the ability to guarantee uncontested commercial transit through Hormuz on immediate demand. And that is a major shift. For decades, the promise was not just that America could eventually punish disruption. The promise was that America could prevent regional powers from dictating the rules of passage in the first place. Right now, that promise looks badly weakened, not dead, but weakened enough that shippers, insurers, allies, and adversaries are all updating their assumptions in real time. And the alliance dimension makes the situation even more revealing. Reuters reported that Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada signed a joint statement condemning Iran's actions and expressing readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage. That is diplomatically significant. But diplomatic alignment is not the same as a ready-made naval solution. The deeper question is whether Western powers, after years of struggling to secure shipping in the Red Sea against the Houthis, are truly prepared for a far harder Hormuz mission against Iran itself. Reuters' analysis was blunt. The Red Sea mission cost billions, expended huge amounts of weapons, and still failed to restore normal shipping. Hormuz is a bigger, more complex, more dangerous problem. That is why this crisis is being watched so closely not only in oil markets, but also in military headquarters, from the Gulf to the Pacific. Adversaries do not need to defeat the United States symmetrically if they can demonstrate a repeatable formula for denial. Saturate a narrow waterway with layered threats, raise the political cost of direct confrontation, fragment the coalition response, and force Washington into a choice between escalation and humiliation. Even limited success with that formula changes the strategic conversation. It tells smaller powers that the age of effortless U.S. maritime enforcement may be over. And it tells larger powers that the real contest is no longer about who has the biggest fleet on paper, but who can make presence too dangerous to translate into control. Meanwhile, inside Washington, the policy signals have looked increasingly unsettled. AP reported that President Trump cycled through multiple approaches, calling for an international coalition, suggesting others should lead, easing some sanctions pressure to push more oil into the market, and then escalating to threats against Iran's civilian power infrastructure if the strait was not reopened. AP also highlighted criticism that the administration's strategy appears reactive rather than coherent. Whether one agrees with that criticism or not, the broader perception problem is obvious. A superpower that appears to be improvising under pressure is exactly what markets fear and adversaries exploit, and that perception itself can become a strategic factor. So where does this go next? There are really only three broad paths. 1. A negotiated de-escalation that restores wider commercial access without either side admitting strategic defeat. 2. A heavily militarized coalition corridor backed by escorts, air cover, mine clearing, and war risk support, expensive, dangerous, and likely incomplete. Or 3. A prolonged era of selective passage, where ships move in reduced numbers under political filtering, insurance remains elevated, and the world adjusts to a more fragmented energy order. As of today, the evidence points closest to that third scenario. Traffic has not normalized. The U.S. still has no public timeline for free movement. Iran is openly conditioning passage, and the market is behaving like a choke point is still under coercion. And that brings us to the bottom line. The question is not whether the United States remains stronger than Iran in a full-spectrum war. Of course it does. The question is whether America can still impose open, neutral, rules-based navigation in the Strait of Hormuz at a politically acceptable cost. Right now, the answer looks deeply uncertain. Iran may not legally control the strait, but it has demonstrated enough coercive reach to influence who moves, how they move, and on what terms. That is not full victory for Tehran, but it is a serious operational setback for the American security model that dominated this region for generations. And until normal shipping returns without Iranian permission, Washington cannot honestly say the old order has been restored. If you want the simplest answer for your thumbnail and your hook, here it is. The U.S. has not lost the war at sea, but it has lost the ability to make the Strait of Hormuz feel unquestionably under American protection. And in global energy politics, that difference is massive. Because once the world stops believing the sea lanes are guaranteed, everything gets repriced. Oil, shipping, insurance, alliances, deterrence, even the meaning of American power itself. So what do you think? Is this a temporary disruption that the U.S. and its partners will eventually reverse? Or are we watching the beginning of a new era in which narrow choke points can be selectively controlled by regional powers using cheaper, asymmetric tools? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more fast, verified updates on the global economy, oil, shipping, and geopolitics, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.